I always make the comparison of, ECW was the Napster of the professional wrestling industry. Napster went bankrupt and went out of business, but it changed the way we listen to music forever, correct?
Yes.
ECW went bankrupt and out of business, and it changed professional wrestling forever.
But it
Whether
wasn't supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be there for the long haul.
live fast, die young.
It's like punk music. Punk music was a blip on the radar screen. It was a cup of coffee when you look at the landscape of music. But what did it do? It changed the landscape of music. Being a fan of ECW, it was an us against them mentality. I kind of based the Busted Open Nation like that as well. Like we're all in this together. Like we are one. That's how I felt like going to ECW, where we would travel to South Philadelphia to go to the ECW arena. Bully, and it wasn't like going to a wrestling show. It was like every time you went, it was like going to Woodstock. It was like you're making a weekend out of it. We're going down for the weekend. We're going to South Philly. We're staying at the Motor Lodge, and we're going to get drunk, and we're going to hang out, and we're going to watch ECW. That's what it was for us fans traveling to the ECW. You didn't go and get there 5 minutes before the show started and then go home as soon as the show was over to beat traffic. Like, you were there for the long haul. And it was even more about what was going on before and after the shows than what was going on actually during the show. It was a pilgrimage. That was a very, very special time. And as I always say, that was the toughest time for me as a wrestling fan, Bully, is when ECW went away. That was like a void that was almost impossible to fill. And there have been things that have come around that have helped fill that void, but I don't think that void has ever been filled. Like Ring of Honor was a big help for me as a wrestling fan, because that's what I really gravitated towards once ECW was gone. Like, then came Ring of Honor and helped kind of fill that void, though it didn't fill the void. It was a very special time, at a very special time for me, because that was when I was in my early 20s. I was in my early to mid 20s. That was like the perfect time for ECW to come around. So I miss it. I miss it every day as a wrestling fan.
And wrestling fans all over the world miss it because it's something that they still bring up to me and want to talk about all the time. And Dave, just to give you like I'm trying to give you a little example about the camaraderie of the locker room and how we were all on the same page. Wrestling's a very cutthroat business, and, the boys will always, try to undermine the boys, but that's not the way it was in ECW. We were all on the same page, fighting for a common goal, working for a common goal. If I was in a bar today and Shane Douglas was standing in another part of the bar, and the Sandman was standing in another part of the bar, and Taz was standing in another part of the bar, if anybody decided to screw with any of us at any given moment, those other guys would be right by each other's sides. We don't know any different. All we knew back in ECW was to have each other's backs. Because we were all on the same team. That's why, do you remember when I asked Shawn Michaels? Remember when Shawn threw the word family out there?
So funny that you brought this up, because when you were talking about that, that's immediately where my brain went when we interviewed Shawn Michaels and you asked him that question.
Shawn threw out family, and like whenever I hear the word, oh, the locker room is like a family, it's like a family, I'm like, ugh. Please, no wrestling locker room is truly like a family. Yeah, when people are making money, the family gets along. When things are going well, the family gets along. So I asked Shawn about, the use of the word family, and he kind of was like, Bubba, you're right. Like when things are good, it's a happy family, but when things aren't. But Shawn brought up ECW to me. And then when he said, you were part of a wrestling family. And it really, really was. I can't describe to you the mentality that we had, because that's the mentality Paul instilled in all of us.
You would run through a wall for Paul Heyman.
The whole company would at one time. That's how much he made us believe. There's that word again, believe. Not only did we make those fans believe, but Paul made us believe in ourselves. I was awful, Dave. Awful. I could not wrestle to save my fucking life. I got exposed by Jimmy Del Rey. But Paul made me believe I could go out there and do anything. All right, Bubba, you're not the greatest wrestler in the world. Go out there and do what you do great. And I don't care what it is. We'll make it work. We'll get it over together. The story of me and Devon. I walked up to Paul and I said, Paul, this babyface shit ain't working no more. But me and Devon have a unique chemistry. Put us together and I think we'll have something special. The answer is this. Okay, go out there and try it. And that's how the Dudleys started. If you believed in yourself, he believed in you. And when you didn't believe in yourself, he believed in you even more. He was a magician when it came to turning chicken shit into chicken salad. There wasn't anything the guy couldn't get over. And when I talk about the word booker, and I always bring Tony Khan up, where people call Tony Khan a booker, and this is not a slack on Tony. Tony's a matchmaker. Paul Heyman was a booker because Paul Heyman sat under the learning tree of some of the greatest managers / bookers and pure bookers that ever existed. You can't become a great booker unless you sit under the learning tree of another great booker or other great bookers. Listen, all of the Paul stories, the bounce checks, the lies, this and that. First, I've never had a bounce check in my life from Paul Heyman. Not me and not Devon. Paul Heyman owes me and Devon $0. Never owed us a dime in our life. He screwed with the Dudley name with us, but business is business, and I learned that as I got more mature. Gave me an opportunity outside of the wrestling ring. When that whole situation with Todd Gordon went down, remember when Todd was like the mole and took a bunch of guys to WCW? Todd was the guy that booked the towns, booked the buildings. He did a lot for ECW, and overnight Todd Gordon was gone. And we're sitting in a coffee shop in White Plains or wherever the hell, in Scarsdale, wherever the hell Paul lived. Me, Paul, Tommy, and Taz. And Tommy and Taz are Paul's right-hand men. I was just a young boy who drove Taz around, who was still making his way in the business. And Paul brought up the whole Todd Gordon situation. He's like, fuck, what are we going to do? I don't have another person who can do this job. I said, Paul, give me a shot. I'll do it. He goes, what do you know about this stuff? I go, absolutely nothing. I go, but I come from a family who has a business background. I know what it's like to run a family business. All I need to learn is kind of the details of what it takes. And I'll do it. Okay, Bubba, the job's yours. And just like that, I became the guy that booked the buildings, made the schedule, did the advertising, all of this, just because the guy gave me an opportunity. I could walk into any wrestling company in the world right now. I could go to the WWE, AEW, TNA, New Japan, and know how to run a wrestling company outside of the ring. Just because of how he taught me and the opportunities that he gave me.
And maybe you have already said it, but if there was one story, if you could share, one story that for you describes Paul Heyman? Is there one story that kind of describes who he was and who he is? Maybe even a story you would share publicly if you were the one to induct Paul Heyman into the Hall of Fame.
About who he is?
Yeah, just about how important he is to the pro wrestling business.
Take Paul Heyman out of the equation. And look at what you take him out of the equation, and there is no ECW. Yeah, there's Eastern Championship Wrestling. Take Paul Heyman out of the equation. Who gives Steve Austin a chance to air his grievances?
We probably never would have saw Stone Cold Steve Austin if it wasn't for Paul Heyman.
Who starts to believe in CM Punk?
Paul Heyman.
The minute Roman Reigns turned to his left and Paul Heyman was sitting next to him, we all looked at Roman a different way.
It's like I always say, the greatest pro wrestling storyline in the last 20 years. And Paul Heyman's a big part of it. And probably a lot of that came from the mind of Paul Heyman.
Who else could have taken a 5'8" guy and turned him into the most credible killer in the business at the time? Taz was challenging Steve Austin. Taz was challenging every other champion in the wrestling business. What promoter, what booker allows their world champion to go on TV and go challenge other guys in other companies? Paul had balls. He went for the jugular every single night. Fuck you, you're wrong. Fuck you, we're right. Those are the words that he uttered to his locker room 10 minutes before Barely Legal went on the air. You take this guy out of the equation, wrestling has a completely different landscape. And that's another, cliche term that, the landscape is about to change. No, it's not. You take Paul Heyman out, that landscape is completely different. Who gives that stoner Rob Van Dam an opportunity? Who gives two fat, out of shape, black guy and white guy bastard brothers an opportunity to go on and become the greatest tag team in the world? Who gives all these guys these opportunities? The rebirth of Terry Funk, Mick Foley, anybody that came through his doors. And I'm not kissing ass or blowing smoke. That would be easy. I'm just stating facts here. This is what the guy meant to the industry. Did he do shady shit? Absolutely. Did he lie to keep his company afloat? Absolutely. Did he hustle? Absolutely. Lie, cheat, and steal? Absolutely. But I never understood what Paul Heyman had to do to keep his company afloat until I owned a business of my own. And then when I owned my own business, I realized, this is not a wrestling business. This was a completely different business. I was like, okay, now I understand why Paul had to do what he had to do. Sometimes he had to rob from Peter to pay Paul. Somebody had to tell this story or do this just to get by. When we were on the Jericho cruise talking about the bereavement fare, because Paul couldn't pay the full fare to get Jericho into Philly, or he waited to the last minute and the ticket was $1,000, but Paul could only pay $300, so he got a bereavement fare. Does he owe people money? Yeah, he does. Did he tell people lies? Sure, he did. But this is the business we have chosen. And it just comes with the territory. Why can some people say that Paul owed them money But I can sit here and say, and Devon can sit here and say, he doesn't owe me a dime. If the day ever came where Paul Heyman ever owed me a dime, I would have walked up right up to Paul Heyman and said, fuck you, pay me. I always, in this business and in life, I go by my experiences and my relationships with an individual. When me and Devon left the WWE and said, the Dudley name is not yours, I said, what are you talking about? The Dudley name's not mine. Paul said he gave it to us. I have paperwork here. And they said, Bubba, go back and read the paperwork. Dude, I felt like such a fool. I wanted to wring Paul's neck. How dare you cost me the name that me and my brother built? I didn't invent it, but I'll be damned if I didn't build it and make it famous. But Paul told me what he had to tell me at the time. I'm done. Paul's gonna, he's gonna draw an audience, but you want somebody who's going to be as big, if not a bigger star than Paul Heyman. Somebody who's going to bring even more eyes. So if Paul was going to bring 1 million people to any, to the viewing, you want somebody who can bring 2 million to the viewing. So I thought about this. There are a couple of names out there. Also, who is going to be able to talk about his early career, his middle career, ECW, his later career, personal stories, all of these things. Who do they have under contract that could talk about Paul? Who checks all these boxes? Now, there are a couple of names out there. I'm going to shoot
one more. Can I throw
yes,
one more?
Absolutely. Two-way talk, Dave. Two-way talk.
Okay. What about, and maybe this is important, maybe it's not, somebody who, like Paul Heyman, was a mentor to them, an influence to them?
Sure. Did you want to throw out another name, or were you throwing out another point?
No, because I'm just using Medusa, so I'm gonna go by the criteria that we just put together, and tell me if Medusa follows the criteria.
I believe that Paul Heyman, in some way, shape, or form, was a mentor to anybody he came in contact with.
Okay.
Other than maybe his early years when he was being mentored by others. But anybody who worked with Paul is going to tell you that they learned a lot from Paul, and Paul helped mentor them. Who is the most obvious two choices in-house right now? No, wait. Oh. I'm going to say there's only one choice in-house right now.
CM Punk.
Correct. Punk is a great choice. First of all, Punk, who should have been wrestling at WrestleMania this year, most likely against Seth Rollins, unfortunately gets the tricep injury. He's on the shelf. They used him at the press conference. And how can we get some of our value, some of our money's worth out of Punk? We're paying him, so let's have him do something. Punk, the first Paul Heyman guy in the WWE, right? Even before Brock. We had Punk, we had Brock, we had Roman.
And Punk has been public saying that the only person that really believed in Punk early on was Paul Heyman.
But Punk he might know of Paul's history, but doesn't have a history with Paul before WWE. So Punk can talk about Paul's history, but he wasn't there. So now I think of two current WWE Hall of Famers that do have a history with Paul Heyman. The first one that pops into my mind is The Undertaker. Paul was Mean Mark Callis's manager, wasn't he?
Yes.
Back in the day. Paul was on the road with The Undertaker. Obviously, the work, working in the WWE with The Undertaker. Taker's got 1,000,001 stories about Paul. I think Taker would do a great job inducting Paul Heyman into the Hall of Fame. But I think there's one better name. And to me, this is the best name. I'm not saying this is the person that they're going to go with, but Stone Cold Steve Austin is the guy to induct Paul. Now, I know there's some suggestions out there that Paul needs multiple inductors to talk about various times in his career. And I like that because I think that would be different. Because there is so much rich history with Paul prior to ECW, during ECW, and after ECW. And listen, let's address the elephant in the room. ECW. This is Philadelphia. If you don't think these people are going to be chanting ECW at the top of their lungs when Paul comes out, when Paul's talking, when Paul leaves, you're a fool. That's what they're going to be chanting. That's what Paul Heyman is most memorable for. Despite his incredible body of work in the WWE, especially what he's doing now with Roman, Paul Heyman will always be synonymous with ECW. And if you didn't want them chanting ECW, you shouldn't do it in Philly.
Well, but that's the thing. I almost feel like you are obligated to have somebody that's a representative of ECW put and induct Paul because you're in Philadelphia.
And Steve Austin is a representative of ECW. Steve Austin knows Paul Heyman for a long time. Personal stories about him. Part of the Dangerous Alliance with Paul. Worked with Paul in WCW. And then Paul leaves WCW and he takes the book and ownership of ECW. Did I say ECW? You know, worked with him in WCW. Now Paul takes the book and ownership of ECW. Austin gets fired via a fax. We all know the story from Eric Bischoff. And Paul Heyman, knowing how pissed off Steve Austin is at the time, and I think he had an injury at the time, says, hey, man, come on in. Stay as long as you want. Here's a live mic. Say whatever you want to say, because I know you're pissed off at the world right now. And on September, I believe, 23rd of 1995, in Middletown, New York, Steve Austin appears. And he's doing his impersonation of Hulk Hogan. And Steve got to be a part of the ECW locker room for a few months. I don't think it was even more. I don't think it was more than 4 months, maybe 5 months.
It was a cup of coffee.
Yeah. But it was long enough for Steve to pull some influences. It was long enough for Steve to get his chops back, his confidence back. It was long enough for Steve to witness a guy named the Sandman. And it was long enough for Steve to work with a kid named Mikey Whipwreck, who had an incredible finishing maneuver called the Whippersnapper. You might have seen or heard of it before, but not under that name. Now we know him as the Stone Cold Stunner.
Yeah.
And what did the Sandman do better than anybody else? Drink beer. And Steve has gone on to talk about how he has pulled some influence. We all borrow from somebody. I didn't invent tables, but I'll be damned if we didn't borrow it. And we all know the stories about who's borrowed from superstar Billy Graham. So Steve spent time in ECW. And even though it wasn't a long period of time, it was quality time. Enough quality time that when WWD did ECW's One Night Stand, the last guy to have an entrance on that show was Stone Cold Steve Austin. And when that ring split in half, and one half of the ring was all the ECW guys, and the other half of the ring was all the WWE guys, and they were about to go to war, whose side was Steve Austin on?
Yeah, I mean, you make, Bully, a very, very valid argument for Stone Cold Steve Austin. Almost an impossible argument to have because of everything you just said. it's almost impossible. It's still not the person I think of when I think of Paul Heyman. Of all, like when you just talked about WCW, ECW, the WWE, with the backdrop of Philadelphia and the backdrop of ECW, because, Bully, you're 100% right. When Paul Heyman hits that stage the night he's inducted, that crowd is going to be chanting ECW. When I think of ECW, I don't think of Steve Austin. I just don't. Everything you said is 100% right. And the stories that Steve Austin will be sharing that night about Paul Heyman are going to be second to none. But with the backdrop of Philadelphia, I still believe there needs to be more of an influence of ECW.
So then who?
I'm going to leave it up to the nation. 877.
No. Hold on. If you say with the backdrop of Philly that it needs to be somebody from ECW or there needs to be a representative of ECW up there, who should it be?
The person that, let me ask you this. Are you asking me who should it be or who would I want to see up there?
I want you to look at it from the business perspective.
You know who I would love to see up there doing it?
That
would be Tommy.
And a lot of people on social media have said Tommy. But you have two WWE Hall of Famers who were pretty big stars in ECW, and that's Rob Van Dam and the Dudleys.
Well, yeah, a lot of people said Jew in the, as with the Dudleys and Rob Van Dam. There's just something about the relationship with Tommy and Paul that I don't think Paul had a relationship with, good and bad, like he had with Tommy Dreamer.
Agreed. It was very much a father and son relationship.
Yes. And when I think of ECW, to me, the face of ECW was Tommy Dreamer.
The only argument I can make for Tommy to not be the guy, and this is strictly from a business point of view, remember what I said earlier about you need somebody who's as big of a star, if not a bigger star, because you're trying to bring eyes to this television show.
But I also think that I think it works because I think it would bring eyes to the show because people know about the dynamic between Tommy and Paul Heyman, the love-hate relationship. The respect is obviously there, but the love-hate relationship between Tommy and Paul Heyman, I honestly, Bully, if I saw Tommy up there inducting Paul Heyman, and then I saw the embrace between those two, that would be a strong enough moment that it would bring me to tears.
Totally agree.
So for that dynamic alone, I think that could bring eyes to a show. Then normally people might say, yeah, you know what? I'm not into the Hall of Fame awards. I'm not into that. But Tommy Dreamer is inducting Paul Heyman. I have to see how that goes down.
Dave, I agree. As Tommy's best friend, as the guy who fought Tommy more than anybody else at ECW, as the guy that worked directly with Tommy and Paul and Taz, I get it. If you just look at this with blinders on from an ECW point of view, yes, Tommy Dreamer is the guy. But this is bigger than ECW. Dave, remember the story that I told you about that match we had in Philly on Monday Night Raw? It was Dreamer and the Dudleys and Rhino versus the whole Wyatt family.
Yes.
And that's the night that I wanted to have the Dudleys turn on Dreamer. And I went and I pitched this to Vince, and I know Vince is not there anymore. I know it's a different regime, a different set of eyes and ears, and I get it. But Vince was like, Bubba, Tommy, really? I'm like, it's the perfect place. It's the perfect time. He's like, I just don't know if Tommy's the right guy. He's not a big enough star. And I'm like, Vince, are you serious? Like, I got into an argument with Vince. The last word I said when I walked out of that office, and I screamed it at the top of my lungs, was fuck. because I couldn't get through to Vince. I couldn't convince. I couldn't close Vince. I believed in Tommy. Vince didn't believe in Tommy on that night. I'm using that as just as like a
barometer.
a barometer for will they want Tommy?
Now
But
like you said, there is a new regime there, and I'm sure Paul has a say in it as well, like of somebody he would like to see induct him. So I don't know if Paul Heyman would want to have Tommy induct him into the Hall of Fame, or maybe he would. Maybe this is the perfect moment and time to mend all bridges between those two. I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility.
It's a great conversation. There are plenty of pros, a couple of cons. I've given you said Medusa. I just don't think Medusa checks enough boxes. And I love Medusa, and her body of work speaks for itself. But I think there are people out there that can speak to Paul and his history maybe a lot better. You see, they did something different with The Undertaker last year. How The Undertaker had the ring to himself. He wasn't standing at a podium. He didn't, he had the mic attached to his head. He had wasn't holding a handheld. They had all the Undertaker different outfits. I like the fact that they did something different with Taker. I'd like to see them do something different with Paul. I don't think that's why I chose Steve. I think if there's any one person who can talk about Paul's entire career, both professional and personal, I believe it's Steve. Of the choices that we have.
Mick Foley's another one that is almost, on par with Stone Cold Steve Austin when it comes to the different stages of the career and everything else.
But Mick never was a part of a Heyman stable. Steve was.
Listen, it's a difficult it's difficult for me to argue against it. That's where it's almost like there's two conversations here, and I'll even throw this out to the nation.
But wait, let me just get back to my point. That's why I'm talking about something different. That's why I think, in wrestling we have the rule of 3. I would not hate if they did something different this year where they had 3 different inductors. Maybe somebody from Paul's past, maybe like Steve Austin were to start, Tommy Dreamer to talk about ECW, CM Punk to talk about the WWE.